The US Secretary of State arriving in Moscow, a trip set to be dominated by difficult negotiations over the future of Syria. Before heading to Russia, Rex Tillerson was in Italy attending a meeting of the G7 grouping of countries. The foreign ministers decided not to impose further sanctions on Russia for now. Since cruise missile strikes last week, the US's closest allies have in recent days been struggling to understand contradictory statements from the Trump administration about its Syria strategy. But after the meeting, the Secretary of State's comments were clear and direct.
I think it is clear that we see no further role for the Assad regime longer term, given that they have effectively given up their legitimacy with these type of attacks.
But that was always the view of the Obama administration, and the reality is that Assad is going nowhere because of Russian support for him. So how do you change that? Well, perhaps a comment about another conflict in a different part of the world may prove important. During a meeting with his French counterpart, Jean-Marc Ayrault, Tillerson asked why US taxpayers should care about Ukraine. Could the Trump administration be following the advice of Jordan's King Abdullah? The president met with the king in the White House last Wednesday. He seemed to have a big impact. After the meeting, Trump said he was changing his view on Assad. At the same time, the king also gave a revealing interview to the Washington Post. He said, "From the Russian point of view, they play what I describe as three-dimensional chess." And he recommended this course of action for the Trump team. You horse trade. For the Russians, I think the most important thing is Crimea. If you come to an understanding on Crimea, I think you will see much more flexibility on Syria. Even if Trump follows the king's advice and offers this sort of grand bargain, it's not at all clear that President Putin would accept. He is in combative mood, suggesting the US may be preparing new attacks in Syria and saying there was no evidence the Assad regime was behind the chemical attack. But at the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, said he'd seen all the classified intelligence and he's in no doubt that Assad ordered it. He had this warning for the government in Damascus.
If they use chemical weapons, they are going to pay a very, very stiff price.
Tough words in Washington ahead of what will be even tougher negotiations in Moscow. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Washington.